If you've just come to this series, then might I recommend that you watch the 3 previous parts. Doing so will certainly lend clarity and background to what is contained here. This project has been one of the most involved to date on the channel. Perhaps an unforeseen benefit to the exaggerated timelines of its production was that it afforded me almost every opportunity to research and explore in a very personal way many of its aspects. This historical supplement will contain the following: a very brief outline of my trip to the Townships, the Needham's performance during the battle, the Fenian cannon, and the historical shooting experiments that Branko and I undertook, which kicked off this whole project some time ago. I visited the Eastern Townships in the fall of 2023, and there I met up with 2 of the key personalities participating in the project, Ross and Lorne. We toured the battlefield and commemorated in our own way the efforts of those who defended their homes and families from the Fenian invaders. We were able to stand on the very ground, in key locations such as the Eccles house, and the actual spot where perhaps the most famous picture associated with Eccles Hill was taken, purportedly of the body of John Rowe, who was killed as he, along with the Fenian advance guard, crossed the Chickabiddy into Canada. The picture, however, was taken at least the day after the battle. The Eccles Hill monument was an obvious stop as well. We paid a visit to the Brome County Historical Society Museum. Ross had been a key contributor to the museum, and the Fenian display was particularly good. We visited the Westover house near Dunham, where Ross introduced me to Mark Alain. He's the current owner, and has taken the history of his house and those who lived in it to heart. Shortly after my visit, Mark Alain hosted members of Asa Westover's extended family, where the occasion was marked by a display of arms, Needhams, and Ballards used at Eccles Hill. It was truly a wonderful visit. As alluded to in previous parts, the foibles of the Needham rifle may have played a role in the Fenian defeat.
The problem with the Needham is that the extractor is coupled to the breech block and cammed in such a way that a cartridge, depending on the cartridge, depending on the gun, can often slip by that extractor and jam in the breech. We have yet to find a specific reference to the Needham either working or not working. No one on the Fenian side says anything about them. They just got them, they're breech loading rifles, and they went into action, and that's basically it. Now, from a few recovered spent cartridge cases have been found on the battlefield in fairly recent years, show evidence of jamming. It's doubtful that anyone had ever even held one or seen one before they went in. Ross Jones did exhaustive trials with a number of different Needhams, both his own and others that were graciously loaned by other collectors and museums, and found that there's just no pattern to it. You never know what's going to work and what doesn't work.
I'm going to demonstrate loading a Fenian musket, a Needham conversion. I have an assortment of bullets, and I'm going to try and show you how they would have done it, possibly under fire. I'll try and do it as fast as I can. That one went in. This one's jammed. This one's jammed. This one's jammed. That's 3 jammed, 1 that went in. This is 4 jammed. 5 jammed. That one went in. Number 6 went in okay. but I'm going to try something very carefully. Now I have to hold the gun with my elbow and my arm. I have to move the block ahead a certain amount, halfway, put the cartridge in, and it closes. That one works. I don't know if I have a lot of time left. The bullets are flying by. If I do this very carefully, trying to close it, that one went in. As you can see, the extractor, the bullet is almost by the extractor. It's only partially passed, but it's jammed. I could possibly force it, but I don't know what would happen. Might fire the shell with the breech open, something I wouldn't want to have happen. Okay.
And I think that was what happened to the Needham. On a range, under controlled circumstances, and if you've got cartridges that you've made up for that gun, and you know that brass has worked in that gun before, as long as you slam it hard enough to get it closed, it works. But in a combat situation, and especially in the hands of young Irishmen, Irish Americans, who had never even seen one before, much less held it, much less marched with it or fired it. And they're handed this gun on their way to the front and a handful of cartridges, which may be any one of several different 58 caliber centerfire cartridges to stick in their cartridge box or their trouser pocket or wherever and go in and try and fight a battle. That's a whole different thing.
During my visit, Ross hosted us for an afternoon on his property where we had an impromptu range session. While he, and to a certain extent Lorne, have a reasonable degree of experience with the rifle, I do not. And so a few rounds were put down range. The foibles of this rifle became apparent upon first handling it. The presence of chronic mechanical issues as a possible reason for reduced Fenian impetus in their attack became all the more clear. We all had a go at the appropriate target for a Needham, a Canadian militiaman who looked conspicuously like Lorne. Mention of the Fenian cannon should be made. This is one of the most mystifying aspects of the battle. There are 4 photos of it from the era, yet its origins and function can only be speculated about. It was in fact a breechloader and fired a self-contained metallic cartridge. By its peculiar screw-type breech and what appears to be a protruding firing pin, as well as a large cutout on the top of the breech area with a protruding handle of what is possibly some sort of removable chamber device, the gun appears to be a curious mix of a Tudor wrought iron breechloader and a Victorian Armstrong breechloader, yet with a self-contained metallic cartridge. As mentioned by Ross, it was taken to the Canadian side and held in a number of locations. Differing groups vied for it as a memento, though it was the Red Sashes, the probable finders of it, who managed to keep it in their possession. The gun is still in existence and is mounted next to the commemoration stone on the Eccles Hill battlefield. Many of its parts are missing, but its pedigree is unmistakable. The screw-type breech closure, the removable chamber, and the sight at the muzzle. The Brome County Historical Society Museum holds a cartridge seized at Eccles Hill. One like it features in period photographs. It has a 2 or 3-pound projectile by reasonable estimate. Perhaps a bit gratuitous, but still of interest, was how it worked, for it is of unknown design and manufacture, and despite the best long-term efforts of many who were much more dedicated than I, no information has surfaced about it. Using the principle of the Tudor breechloader, with its replaceable chamber inserts, I speculate the Fenian gun worked like this. The cartridge, which was centerfire and metallic, was placed in the chamber insert. This added strength to the copper riveted construction of the case. The chamber insert was then fitted to the breech opening, where it aligned with the bore. The breech screw was then rotated, thus moving some sort of plate forward, pushing the chamber insert forward and sealing the breech. To fire the piece, the exposed firing pin at the rear of the breech screw was struck, which drove the firing pin into the primer, thus firing the round. The breech was then unscrewed, releasing the chamber insert, which was removed and replaced with another. Using a system of multiple inserts, a relatively rapid rate of fire could conceivably have been had. Perhaps the best indication of the gun's function is in this photo. The gentleman behind the gun is holding the chamber insert in his right hand. Here you can see its cylindrical nature and the open end through which the projectile would pass upon firing. During my visit to the Townships, I was introduced to Lawrence Cotton, who, as a Fenian raids enthusiast, actually constructed a replica of the Fenian gun as a way to preserve the history of Eccles Hill. An obvious labor of love, he did the memory of the battle and those who fought in it proud. Despite all the 3D imagery, albeit of hobby-grade quality, and talk of history, the root of this project was shooting. To that end, a number of experiments were conducted to allow us to better appreciate how the battle was shaped by the weapons used. Some for honest evaluation, and others simply for the gravity born from actually hitting and knocking over targets. It was Branko and I who performed the majority of the shooting evolutions that were simple, yet designed to evaluate the Snider and the Ballard, importantly, at appropriate ranges. Branko shot 2 Ballards for this project, his personal carbine and a rifle version kindly sent in the post by Ross. Grouping both was the starting point. So that was your 5 rounds with your Ballard carbine. You want to run us through your group here, Branko?
So we have a fairly decent group over here. The point of aim was at the bottom here, about half sight, and so far the Ballard's doing fairly well. I'm not at all displeased.
So, Branko, that was 5 rounds with Ross's Ballard rifle with provenance to the red sashes.
At least to a family that had one of their members at the Battle of Eccles Hill.
This is as close to Eccles Hill as we are going to get.
And this is pretty close.
And a fantastic experience. Let's have a look at see how it shot your ammunition.
It's a much bigger group, but this is the first time I'm shooting this gun. I have not had a chance to do any load development, so this isn't too bad. I think this gun could do much better, but it would take me quite a bit of time to experiment and shrink that group, and I believe it's possible.
Right.
So this is not bad. This is pretty good for first time out.
Sure. And just what a great touchstone with history, eh?
Yes.
Thanks to Ross. Once the benchmarks had been made, it was time to try for hits on a somewhat more realistic target. For this application shoot, a large, nearly life-size target was used. The range of 150 yards mimicked that from which the red sashes engaged the Fenian advance guard. A combination of positions was used to better reflect those that were probably adhered to by the red sashes as they fought from amongst the rocks and trees of Eccles Hill. So, Branko, we've just fired the engagement practice, as it were, to simulate the engagement of the Fenians by the red sashes from the flank position at about 100, 150 yards away.
Right.
And now we're going to go and see how the rifle performed.
fairly good. We've got a group down over here. So I was aiming at the center of the column. Again, I've not shot this gun at 150 yards, so I wasn't sure where it was hitting. Fairly good group. If I would have shot it up here, would have been getting a group right about there. So not bad. Most of the Ballard rifles that were used by the Red Sashes had the longer barrels, and they've had a lot more practice than I have with them. So pretty good.
Right, so I mean, the grouping wise,
It's actually quite nice.
it's
yeah, at
actually doing
150.
all right, eh?
For a 22-inch barrel carbine, that's pretty good.
Right. And then we have another grouping over to the right.
They'll be here, and this is the last three, and I was aiming about here. That is the result of the 3 rounds there.
So if we were to do this again, then we're talking about perhaps adjustment of sights,
Adjustment of sights and aiming
a little bit higher.
about here.
Right. Right. Okay. Where perhaps the hits aren't on the individual figures, but the shooting that you were doing and the groupings that you're getting using the same point of aim are speaking pretty significantly to what
Well,
the rifle's capable of, right?
The gun is definitely capable of consistent fire at 150 yards, even further beyond that.
Sure.
So it's certainly not impossible for the Red Sashes to have been able to consistently hit targets at that distance.
Well, with groupings like that, as long as they knew their point of aim and their
Right.
ranges, then there's
They
no
could do
reason to
that.
believe they wouldn't, eh?
Yeah.
Despite the lack of Zero, Branco's groups were certainly cause for understanding of how effective the Ballard could be. Taking flanking fire from 20 or so such rifles used by men well practiced would have caused the Fenian advance guard untold misery and concern. With the Ballard evaluated, it was time to test the Snider at a range of 300 yards, reflecting that shot by the men of the 60th Battalion as they engaged the Fenians from the eastern spur. Again, a mixture of positions was used. We settled on a 10-round practice, shot simultaneously using independent fire.
Where are they?
The idea was that this tactic
Okay,
was used by
here's
the
where I'm
militiamen
at.
in their extended order positions that they found themselves in on Eccles Hill. By doctrine, a file, 2 men acting as a team, would alternate their fire for the first rounds, then carry on, naturally staggered in their loading and delivery of fire. Chances are, the longer the action lasted, the less formal the tactics were. As you can see here, by the delivery of the first couple of rounds, we weren't exactly adhering to the drill book.
You were a little high on that one.
Of course, we can assume that after the initial rounds hit home and the Fenians went to ground, firing would ebb and flow as targets and Fenian fire caused appropriate and increased response. As discussed in part 1 of this series, musketry training was supposed to follow that practiced by the British Army, doctrine being, at least notionally, the same across the Empire. Officially, the Snider was shot out to 800 yards as per the 1870 musketry instruction. This involved individual practice and collective firing in the form of volley firing, independent firing, and in addition, there was skirmishing practice whereby groups of men fired and advanced down to and back from a series of targets using the field evolutions and tactics of the era. Had the men at Eccles Hill shot at 300 yards before? One might expect they had, 300 yards not being overly onerous on the use of ground. Had they shot at 800? Well, they might have. The longer the range, however, the less probability existed that they had the chance to do so. We might, by today's individual standards, judge 300 yards to be somewhat longer range. Doctrinally, that range was well inside of what might be called decisive or close range in the language of the era.
That's me.
The accuracy and rate of fire of the relatively new Snider rifle would certainly tell if shot by men even remotely competent in sight setting,
Right.
aiming,
Good
and
shooting.
firing.
It looks like they've scattered.
Yeah.
Well, there you go, Branco. Our engagement at 300 yards to simulate the militia's engagement of the Fenians at Eccles Hill. So we had, 20 rounds between the two of us?
Right.
Fired independently. There's not really any information that I have seen to indicate if specifics of any kind of fire control, whether they fired volleys or something. I would tend to reason that it was a little bit more loosey-goosey.
Right. Independent fire.
Yeah. So that said, independent fire thing does have some advantages. It provides you the opportunity to take good aim and take your time, but it also has a tendency to allow you to let it get away on you as well, and perhaps shoot a bit faster than you probably should. So we fired, as I say, 20 rounds in all, and I think we counted up a total of 12 hits on the paper, with 9 hits proper on the figures.
Individuals,
on the figures, right? So I know we've got one on the shoulder here, and then moving across the leg here, just clipped here. As we come across, one right here through the flag, and then on your side,
down here, the neck over here, and the knee right there.
Right. So of these 7 figures, we had 2 that came away unscathed, I believe. The center, our color bearer, and the fellow on their right over there. Yeah. Well, that was a fun shoot, though.
Yeah.
The fact that we were able to do it together, for me personally, was something that was a really cool takeaway from that. Against almost life-size targets, right? I know this fellow here is pretty close to life-size.
He's a little bit smaller.
They're a little bit smaller, but given the fact of the type of engagement it was, which was essentially a column coming up a road, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that a round that missed somebody here and went over the shoulder, say, maybe even
carried
here,
on.
or even the hits that we clipped the top up there, stands to reason that those would have carried on, especially given the fact that the militia was in an elevated position over the border crossing.
Yes.
That those rounds could have carried over into it was about a 200 man?
Initially 200 or so, yeah.
That came across. So a fairly dense, compact mass of people.
Yeah.
So, near misses, it stands to reason, as I mentioned, would probably have struck somebody.
Yeah.
So I guess all in all, in terms of the 20 rounds fired, it's not particularly stellar shooting on either of our parts.
No, but
however, it does speak to the type of engagement.
And there was only 2 of us, and at the actual engagement initially, there would have been 20 in that company that would have fired. So there would have been a lot more lead flowing in their direction.
Right.
And for what it seems like, what they needed to do is provide cover for the red sashes to be able to move out of that position. So they would have done, even if they didn't hit that many targets, just bringing the amount of lead onto that road or that bridge that the Fenians were moving over would have been enough to, if not stop, then it did the job.
Sure.
They definitely went to cover.
Right. And I guess that as we look at the accounts, that is something that features prominently in the way the action ebbed and flowed, is that initial advance by the Fenians across the border in a relatively compact mass and sort of marching formation, if you will.
Yeah.
When they were hit, we fired 10 rounds apiece, and how long did that take? I'm not quite sure, but it didn't.
5 minutes maybe, or
less than that.
Yeah.
But those 200 individuals, once the round started flying from 2 directions now, chances are they wouldn't have hung around for that long. And once that initial sort of, I say volley, whether it was an actual volley or not, but that initial engagement of a few rounds per person, that the Fenians would have understood what was happening and would have sought cover quite immediately.
Yes.
And I guess when you look at the accounts, that's exactly what happened.
That's what the accounts tell us. Now, most of the accounts are from the Canadian side rather than the Fenian side, but that seems to be what eventually happened. That they went to ground and didn't advance anymore.
Right, and then sought cover behind the houses and the undulations and the ditches and
rocks and
whatever they could. Yeah. So anyway, I thought that this was going to be a good way to sort of put that initial engagement sort of to the test. It's not about trying to winkle people out from behind houses or behind walls or something, but that initial kind of relatively large target, and see what our 10 rounds a man ended up looking like. So I'm pretty happy with the fact that it all came together, and the 2 of us were able to do that together, because it's always more fun doing it with somebody than by yourself. So I appreciate that for sure. All right.
So that was the Ballard and Snider evaluations, shot at ranges appropriate for the positions they were used from. All in all, a valuable practice at every turn. Apart from the, shall we say, more formal practices, occasion was taken to conduct some simple plinking evolutions, using reactive, though scaled-down targets. These weren't meant to be anything but basic demonstrations of the rifle's use. Mostly conducted between 50 and 75 yards, there wasn't any specific number of rounds prescribed. Shooting this way achieved two things. Firstly, it was fun. And secondly, it was a useful source of atmospheric, or B-roll shooting that could be used to further enrich the storytelling. And lastly, there is seldom a better way to illustrate the power of these antique arms. The effect of 500 plus grains of lead traveling at 1,200 feet per second can be devastating. So this brings to a conclusion the Eccles Hill series. I hope that you've enjoyed this somewhat detailed look at the battle and the circumstances surrounding it. Canadian military history, especially domestically, is easily forgotten. But it is there, and it is fascinating in its own right. And of course, one final thank you I extend to Ken, Ross, Lorne, and Branko, who lent of their time and considerable expertise in the making of this series. To you, I salute, in the correct mid-Victorian palm-down style, of course. If you'd like to view British muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well.